So we're going to get into Roman art now. We're going to look at Roman sculpture. And the first thing that you need to know is I have a sort of period style name that's a little different than some other professors. I prefer to call the period between 100 to 315 the classic Roman era as a sort of blanket term for my students for a survey introduction. But if you're studying with someone else, there are at least two distinct periods. One's the Roman Republican period, which is really in the 1st century BCE. And then slightly after that, and sort of overlapping with it, is the Empire period in which the Caesars come about. You have Julius Caesar and Augustus, and then a series of emperors that come into power. So there are some distinct differences in Roman sculpture, even though it's based on the schema or based on the earlier period of the Athenian Golden Age. What I'm specifically talking about in terms of the artwork from ancient Rome is the idea that the work is, the term is a verist tradition or verism, V-E-R-I-S-M. And the idea is based more or less on the idea that you have earned these wrinkles, you've earned the look, you're an older person who's defined themselves through a lifetime of hardship and working hard, and these sculptures represent that. There's also the idea of tracing your ancestry back. So if you look at the sculpture on the left-hand side, what you see first of all is a Roman patrician with busts of his ancestors, and the busts he's carrying are actually, they would have been made out of wax and kept in a room called the Triclinium. And these busts of wax were basically our portrait photos today, like of our ancestors, of our grandparents. It's kind of like almost like a photo album, but more like the kinds of things we put on a mantle. And they would have been made out of wax and placed in this room. And on funerals, when someone had died, you would carry these busts out into the street. You would dress up in clothing that was similar to the person. You would act like that person who died. It's a little bit like the Day of the Dead if you really think about it. And so the small bust that this patrician is holding is actually the one in his right hand. Our left hand side is actually a woman. So you can see they're not really interested in sort of cleaning up and making people beautiful. They're really interested in showing exactly how these people looked so that you would have a recording of it. And in his left hand, he actually has a male figure. And so what we kind of have here is an image made out of marble that's life-size. That would have been a very wealthy person's version of this, in which he actually took the wax portraits, held them, and had a sculptor re-record everything. So it's like a photo of a photo of a photo in a way. The other character that we see here of this other Roman patrician from Ottoccioli is basically, we see every wrinkle. We see, you know, this guy kind of looks like the Godfather, and it's a way of showing how powerful he is. And you can read the character in his face. This tradition, the sculptures would have been painted, and that's kind of an important idea because we'll look at other Roman sculptures and friezes and bas-relief sculpture, and we'll see that they were usually painted with encaustic paint, so there's usually traces of pigment on these things. Sometimes if you wanted something a little bit more permanent, what you might have is a sculpture that was made out of clay, terracotta, and then you painted that. And if you look at this, they're not interested in idealizing. He has that fatty deposit under his chin. He's got a really big nose, and these were considered emblems of the character of the person, and that the character was very important. So I think that there's a suggestion in terms of an overarching concept that the Romans distinguished themselves through battle and through war, the same way the Greeks did, but that in a way, the Romans are really attempting to show a little bit more who they are, that it's more important that the individuality in Roman culture sort of comes out. And we saw that in the late Hellenistic sculpture of the Laocoon, where it's more dramatic, it's a little bit more about the full story, it's a fuller experience. And I think in Roman art, they're building on the schema of the early Athenian or classic age of Greek art, and they're just filling out the tradition and making it a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more detailed. When we look at sculptures of women, you know, the intention initially is when they're younger, of course, they want to see themselves as beautiful, and so we have a depiction here. And this sculpture of a young Flavian woman, which is contemporary with the Colosseum, so that's a good way of linking them up. is a really beautiful depiction of a young, pretty woman who is has done her hair up using curling irons and putting various products in it. And we kind of have a full shot of her hairstyle that I'm sure she was very proud of and the sculptor tried to capture. And at that age, that's the kinds of things that, in terms of if you wanted to have a depiction of yourself, you want to see yourself as more attractive. But it's not limited to that idealized young age for women. And what I'm talking about is there are other depictions of women that we've seen one already. Here's another one. And you can see this is almost like the male figures. It's not meant to be cleaned up or sanitized in any way. She has bags under her eyes, that this is truly who that person is, and it shows her character. So there isn't a tendency to idealize in Roman art unless it's an emperor. And we're going to see that with portraits of Augustus Caesar, that he is really idealized in his portraits. There still is a little remnant of the Verist tradition in his work, but I guess it's just sort of like how we airbrush pictures of Bill Clinton and President Obama and stuff like that when we have depictions of our leaders, that we sanitize them and clean them up a little bit. One of the first things that you need to know about the Roman Empire and the Roman tradition is basically that the Republican period was a time of expansion, and a lot of generals really made themselves known by how they expanded and what they did and that kind of thing. And so they really owned most of Europe, and a lot of people wanted to be part of the Roman Empire and part of the provinces because the Romans brought things like aqueducts, sewage. They also policed things. They had major building projects in their empire. And so by the time Julius Caesar comes to power, there is this tradition, really almost of like 100 years of really the empire expanding and bringing back goods to Rome, and major building projects, and a sort of infrastructure that's installed by being part of one of the provinces of the Roman Empire. Now, Julius Caesar was a good emperor for a while, but remember, on the 15th of March, the Ides of March, he is assassinated because he was given the right to be a dictator permanently, lifetime. And there's a long history involved with the life and times of Julius. Basically, I'll see if I can summarize it in like 30 seconds. He rises to power after he defeats another general. This general that he defeats is actually flees to Egypt, and where he is assassinated, and his head is sent back to Julius. Julius is fairly disgusted with this, but the Senate votes to have him become a lifetime dictator, which basically means that he has a permanent right. And they used to give this, I think, as short terms, like 6 months to a couple of years, where someone who was a general in times of stress would be voted to be a dictator, and they would have absolute power like a king. But Julius was given it permanently. So his compatriot Brutus didn't like this, basically was uncomfortable with it because he thought that Julius was going to become a king rather than really someone who allowed the Republican sort of era to continue, and so he was murdered. Well, his nephew, Julius's nephew, comes in and enters the power vacuum and becomes Augustus. His real name is, I think, Octavius, but then he becomes Augustus because that's a name that's given to him, which is related somewhat to his divinity as an emperor. So this portrait of Augustus I have on the right-hand side, how you would fill it out for one of my tests, and so the slots are kind of made clear to you. And on the left-hand side, we see a sculpture that you've probably seen before, the Doryphorus by Poli Titus from 5th century Greece. And so it makes sense to compare the two and sort of do a comparison where we build on the schema of the Doryphorus on the left-hand side by Poli Titus as the canon and the standard, and how this portrait of Augustus builds on it. And in some ways that'll give you a big picture of how the Roman Empire built itself on the traditions that were based on the Greek past. First of all, you can see that they're both standing in contrapposto. And so they're standing in contrapposto, and they have similar kinds of bodies and similar kinds of gestures. We see the idealized musculature. We see a very realistic depiction of the anatomy, but there are still some idealized and stylized versions of it. But they're still both athletic and powerful. the contrapposto is meant to make them both look lifelike and realistic. They're both made out of marble, and this might also relate to some context, which I think is important. Remember that the sculpture on the left, which is of the Doryphorus, is actually a Roman copy of a bronze original that was made around 450 BCE, right? So those were all the cire perdue, or lost wax process bronzes. And this portrait of Augustus, actually, there was other versions of it made out of bronze. This particular portrait of Augustus, made out of a cheaper material, marble, and would have been painted, was actually found in the palace or the house of Livia, his third wife. And so the iconography of it, or the symbolism behind it, is also fairly interesting. And so we can kind of take a look at how the form and the iconography come together. Let's start first by looking at the faces. The faces, we have Doryphorus on the right-hand side and Augustus on the left-hand side. You can see that Augustus, even though he's idealized and made kind of handsome, he still has this slightly kind of pushed out ears that are a little bit like a wing nut, and he's got a slightly weaker chin, and we see a kind of larger nose than the Doryphorus. So we see that it's actually meant to be a bit of a likeness, even though it's an idealized likeness. It's not like the other Verist portraits that we looked at. So those are some ideas. The eyes are overly large. They have a slightly archaic smile. Some people would argue that the Doryphorus actually has a more severe look on his face and does not really have the archaic smile, that little grin or that pleasant look. So depending on who you're studying with, you need to be able to talk about that. The next thing about the portrait of Augustus that we need to talk about is that it was found in Prima Porta in Rome, in Livia's palace when they excavated it. So it was basically kind of a private portrait, and we're not sure if it was made before or after his death. There's some indication that it might have been after. So a standard reading of the iconography of this that you can find, for instance, in Marilyn Stockstad's art history that I use as a textbook, is that if you look at the figure himself, he's idealized. He's carrying a staff, where the Doryphorus would have been carrying a spear. He's carrying a staff, which means he's the leader of the Senate. He is standing in a pose in which he is actually not necessarily dictating, but he's speaking. And that ties in with an earlier sculpture that we'll look at in a minute. And he is wearing a cuirass, which is a piece of armor that shows his military might, and he's got a long toga wrapped around his waist. And at his feet, he's not wearing the boots that you would actually expect a Roman soldier to be wearing, that would be for the military, and that probably represents that he has been apotheosized, and we'll talk about that in a second too. And there's also a Cupid riding on the back of a dolphin. So we have all these accoutrements that are added on to the Doryphorus, the armor, all of these things that actually depict his role in life, that give him an identity. Let's start by first looking at the pose. The pose is based in a culture that's earlier Italian/Roman, the Etruscan order. The Etruscan people, we're not really sure where they came from. There's some sort of indication that they might have been immigrants from Asia Minor, that they were from what we call Turkey today and had moved there. And there are these sort of sites that they've excavated, and they are a little bit earlier. And then the Romans sort of spring up and become this Italian force that take over the Italian peninsula and establish themselves as the Roman Empire. So it starts out first with an earlier tradition that's lifelike. The Etruscans really dug the Greek art, and we see here, this is a guy who's actually in ad locutio gesture, which basically he is debating a point, or he's an orator who is actually telling a convincing point. And you can see that Augustus is in that same pose and follows kind of the same tradition, both standing in contrapposto. They're both kind of in that way of depicting that he is making a powerful point. And if he's on the Senate floor, he is speaking and he's actually sort of making an important point, and that's why he has his hand raised like that in that gesture. At his feet, which are bare, is a portrait of Venus. There's a couple of different interpretations and some background that I feel is important for you to be able to get some enjoyment out of looking at this sculpture. So let's first talk about the bare feet. The bare feet might represent that he has actually died and been lifted up and apotheosized, and he's basically on Mount Olympus in the heavens with the rest of the gods. And this is kind of a standard depiction of iconography that you actually see even in the Jewish and Christian faiths. For instance, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and has to take his feet off because he's on holy land. So after he dies, he is voted as a god. And so the Senate actually voted to apotheosize him, which means he basically became a god after his death. In the provinces, he actually was known as a god while he was alive, and that's a complex issue that we don't have time to talk about right now. Now, the next thing is we see this Cupid riding on the back of a dolphin. The dolphin's kind of diving into the water here. And that means that it traces, and we know this for fact, that he built temples to Venus. And what Augustus believed was that he was descended directly from Aeneas. Remember the Aeneid by Virgil, the poet from the 1st century BCE? That the Romans had this idea that they had descended in some way from Aeneas, who was descended from Venus, and Aeneas started the Roman Empire, and Aeneas had some kids, Romulus and Remus, and they were raised by a she-wolf, and there's this whole mythology surrounding Romulus and Remus, and there's actually a sculpture that depicts them that has little babies that has been restored from the Renaissance. And so Cupid is the son of Venus, and so in a way, Cupid is kind of one of the ancestors of Augustus. Now, that means he is literally descended from the gods, and so an apotheosis makes sense. Now, there are other interpretations of those two symbols, and the two interpretations that I got from my professor, Herbert Broderick, probably when I studied with him in the 90s, around 1993, he suggested that the bare feet of Augustus mean that he's kind of like Antaeus, one of these mythological figures who Hercules defeated by lifting him off the earth. And Antaeus actually got his power from Gaia, Mother Earth. Well, as long as he was in contact with the earth, he was powerful. So this might represent victory on land. And that the winged figure of the Cupid is actually kind of a victory figure, a Nike figure. And he is on a dolphin, so this might represent victory at sea. So those are some alternative definitions or explanations of the iconography. The next chunk of iconography that we're going to be looking at is his breastplate, this cuirass. And it really has a bunch of propaganda scattered across it. And so the main scene, we have this commemorative setting in which, first of all, at the very top, we have the sun god Sol. You might know him as Helios, and he is riding on top of the world, and above him is Caelus, the sky god, and they are sort of overseeing his victory. So we have these references to mythology. Then you've got this scene in the very center in which we have Augustus receiving this standard in which he basically was able to defeat the Parthians, and the Parthians had taken one of these standards or sort of a banner, and they are returning it to him. Then underneath that, we have other figures where we have a Mother Earth reclining, and Mother Earth is actually she has a cornucopia in her lap full of fruits. And so a lot of these things sort of imply this victory and that there's a time of Roman peace that Augustus has installed. And so a lot of the iconography on this is representation of his power on the earth and the kinds of peace he brings. And it makes sense. It's almost like a hieroglyphic explanation of his power. Now, the last thing that I want to discuss with you is that we know that this sculpture had some traces of pigment, and so I just wanted to kind of show you the sort of garish way in which this would have painted. And a lot of people find this really disturbing, that the sculpture would have been painted in these kinds of colors and that kind of stuff. And you know, I think it's just chalked up to our modern aesthetic, that we found these sculptures after they had been weathered clean and made, sort of washed by age, time, and the natural elements into their pure white marble state, but they actually would have been highly colorful, and this is called polychromy or polychromy.